Good evening and welcome to everyone that is joining us for tonight's episode of the 6 series. The 3-letter word that no one wants to speak about, but the truth is it's usually on our minds, on our brains. We often think about it, but no one wants to speak about it, especially in church.
100%. Welcome, everyone. It's really great to have everyone here. And also to those that are watching us on the live stream, it's really great to have you joining us as well. And we're just really looking forward to tonight's conversation. We've got some amazing people that are going to be joining us. And we'll introduce them in a second, but it's going to be really, really good.
Absolutely. And just a couple of notices before we kickstart with today. The first is that very soon on the 11th of September, we're going to be starting the Alpha course or Alpha experience, because that's what it truly is. If you're wondering what Alpha is, it's a safe space where we invite people, seekers or people with questions. Maybe you used to attend church religiously, and now you've just have these questions that you struggle to reconcile with your faith experience. It is a space where those kind of questions are welcome, a space where there is no judgment, and where we all together acknowledge that God is a much bigger mystery, and we are allowed to have questions so that we can discover more of this beautiful phenomena.
Yeah, and it's really something that everyone can get involved in. There's a whole bunch of ways to get involved. One of them being, if you want to be part of the Alpha course and just want to be part of this journey of exploration, there are QR codes that are up in the foyer. If you want to go scan them and sign up, we'll put them up for the next couple of weeks around here as well as the links that will be sent out on the Gracepoint WhatsApp Connect, and you'll be able to find it on our website after some time. It's on there already, right? Yeah,
absolutely.
So you'll be able to sign up to join us. Those that have done Alpha before, if you feel maybe on your heart you want to come and facilitate a group, or you want to help with the hospitality aspect, inviting people, there's loads of ways to get involved as a team member. Then all of us can help by inviting someone. I don't think there's any one of us that doesn't know someone that's, asked a question about faith at a point or has wondered. So we can all just invite someone to come join the Alpha course. You can keep us in prayers, just as we pray together and pray for one another and those that are going to be attending the Alpha course. And then lastly, obviously with the courses and things happening around church, it does have a financial implication. So if you would like to help by giving financially to the Alpha course, you can just email alpha@gracepoint.co.za and you'll get in contact with how you can give and donate.
Absolutely. And then lastly, next week is another exciting 3rd week experience. We've got Closer, a worship evening where you can really just come and almost be, taken over by a mood of worship. It's a beautiful space where we really just gather once a month and we worship together. So that's also an invitation. Everyone is welcome. And that's it. If you'd maybe love to open for us in prayer, Ilse.
Absolutely. Let's pray together. Loving oh God, we thank you for this opportunity to just come together as your people, as young people, as people from different walks of life, different stages in their journey of faith, people from different experiences and just different points of view. We thank you that we can just gather under this one banner, that we are here as your people. And so God, tonight we just pray that the conversations we may have may be just in line with what you want us to do. And we just ask that we may approach it with hearts that are open, minds that are open, and just a general openness to be able to engage with one another and not to judge one another or not to feel that we are condemned, but rather to be open to hear and to explore and to experience. And so we just pray for your hand over the space tonight, God. And we just pray for each and every person here. And for those that are still traveling here, we just pray for your traveling mercies. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. And without wasting any time, we're going to invite everyone who's joining us for tonight's panel to please join us. And those who are online, to please switch on their cameras. And yeah, maybe in the meanwhile, while they join us, I can just find out quickly from all the Man U supporters, how's everyone? Kaizer Chiefs supporters, any Kaizer Chiefs? Yes, please. Any Kaizer Chiefs supporters? Chelsea is putting together the strongest team in history. Absolutely. We are at church. People should not be checking their phones. Put your phones away. We're at church. Let's not check EPL score, please.
And now we ask the question, as South Africans, are we okay after yesterday's rugby? Are we okay? Are we okay? Yeah. I love it.
Awesome. Without wasting any time, I'd like to welcome a very close friend of mine, Anela Siswane, whom I love and appreciate so much. Father Bruce, I've heard exciting things about you. Reverend Bogomutu Dikuling, someone who's really exciting. After this, you will agree with me. And Dr. Eve, whom I've had the pleasure of listening to so many times and look forward to hear you share with us today.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
So we're just going to kind of go around the panel. Dr. Eve, since you are already got your mic on, why don't you just start by introducing yourself and just giving us a little bit of who you are, what you do, and how you got into it, maybe.
Got into sex.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, why not? So I started out my career as a clinical social worker, then did a master's. I went into family therapy. And when I was working as a family therapist, I realized that, children were symptomatic because parents were problematic. And I moved into working just with couples. And as I started working with couples, circa South Africa, 1990s, apartheid, no sexuality, no information, complete censorship. And I began to talk to couples and they wanted to know about sexuality, which then began my career internationally. I had to go overseas and train to become a couple and sex therapist and then get a doctorate in human sexuality. And so my career has moved along into the world of sexuality in a very scientific way. Today, I end up many years later still being a clinician, which is my biggest passion, and being an activist certainly for women defender of women, sexual justice, sexual rights, sexual health, sexual pleasure. And my therapy work right now is all through what's called a trauma-informed lens, because I found that working with intimacy has a lot of traumatic experiences for people, either because of their own childhood experiences of trauma or because of violent sexual rape or other kind of shock traumas in their adult lives. And obviously religion plays a hugely important part in people's sexuality. And as I have learned over the many years of being a clinician, I've really delved into religion and the influence of that, positively and negatively, depending on the interpretation of that on people's sexuality. So it's been a very fascinating part of my work, is the aspect of the impact of religion on intimacy and sexuality.
Thanks so much, Dr. Eve. If we can start on this side, we can hear from you, Ruth.
Hi, I'm Khomotse Dutrileng. I am a Methodist minister in Edenvale. I am also an author, a person simply with a keen interest on life and things religious and theological. I identify really more as a spiritualist and do not really hold any consecutive views on matters, because I really think we are an amazing species with a deep gift of God, or from God, to fathom issues of our lives. And we are an evolving species, and we should embrace that evolution with keenness of mind and openness of spirit, that we can indeed fathom this mystery called God. So yes, if I'm going to shock you tonight, welcome to my world.
Thank you so much, Ruth.
So I'm Bruce Botha. I am a Jesuit priest, same as Pope Francis. I belong to a group called the Society of Jesus. My background is in education. My first degree was in education. I spent a few years happily teaching physical science, chemistry, and so on before joining the priesthood. And as a priest, I have worked in Soweto for 10 years. And now I'm currently working in Braamfontein, which is right next to Wits. And I am a university chaplain and the pastor of that community.
Thank you. Thank you. Over to you, Anele.
My name is Anele Siswana. I am a clinical psychologist and hold many different hats. I identify as a queer man. My preferred pronouns is he and him. My interest in the kind of work that I do stems from my clinical work and mostly studies around gender and sexuality, but mostly interested in queer sexualities, in how we think of non-normative kind of sex, intimacy, and desire, and questioning the whole ideas and notions of how church governs pleasure and intimacy. I'm also a spiritual healer. Reverend D, I do not like to refer myself as a traditional healer because of the old notions and assumptions that are attached to what traditional healers do, but I prefer to use the word a spiritual healer because it provides and holds space for intersectionalities of faith and spiritualities and doctrines that are not necessarily dogmatic in their view. So my views are quite controversial, and you know, being friend to Hloni, there's no way you can be conservative about it. So thank you.
Wow, thank you, Anele. Thank you, Anele. I think just a disclaimer to everyone that is gathered here today. So, you know, as the gathering, our objective is not to leave here agreeing on everything that's been discussed, but we agree that this is a space where we engage mystery and we tap into this beautiful thing called life and we discover more of it. That is our hope out of this. And so just to kick us off, I'm going to throw this at everyone as we start. Why are Christians or humans so awkward around sex? Like you would swear that, and I think you asked a similar question, Rev D, last week. You know, you ask Christians about sex, it's like, I'll tell you, growing up, if you wanted to be one of the most corrupt, uncouth kids on campus in primary school, you had to write sex on anything that you come across, whether it's a bathroom wall or a bathroom door or staircase. If you write sex, listen, you have broken the biggest rule ever. And so I'll start with you, Rev D. That's what Anila called you, so I'm going on the train, eh? So I'll start with you, Rev D, and then we'll go with Dr. Eve and Father Bruce and Anele.
Well, thank you for throwing me into the deep. I think the issue of sex being a taboo subject where Christians are concerned, for me, stems from how sex is predominantly depicted in the Bible itself. And you will know that as Christians, our lives are governed or are founded in the teachings of the Bible. And therefore, when you read the Bible, and you do not have to be deeply theologically trained to pick this up, you find that predominantly in the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, sex is couched in very negative terms. right from the book of Genesis, it's depicted as something used to manipulate others, to control, to dominate, to violate, to hurt, to break, and by the way, it's done by both men and women in the Bible, because in Genesis 19, the whole thing is done by a woman manipulating the sex to her advantage, and it goes up, and therefore it's couched in very negative terms. And furthermore, as you go into the New Testament, it speaks about sexual immorality, and therefore it attaches to sex the very notion that it is immoral. And then you come into a space of culture. And I think I would be safe in saying all cultures in the world are really covering this whole thing in secrecy, and there is no openness in talking about it, whether European, African, Asian, all of us as the human species. As you said, we think about sex, we imagine our stuff, we play video clips in our minds about it, and yet we do not want to openly talk about it. And for me, fundamentally, from a Christian perspective, it is because of the predominant depiction of sex in the Bible.
Thank you. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Eve.
Yeah, thank you for that. Just to continue that conversation, I think that the reason why sexuality is so taboo is because society needs it to be. If you think about, what determines our sexuality, we are controlled by three systems or institutions. The one, of course, is a religious system. Another one is a medical system, which tells us, we couldn't get AIDS or STIs or infections, and we're going to, maybe even die with sexuality. And then the third system is a legal system, which really tells us who and when and where and what we should be doing around sexuality. So these systems are there to try and control this thing called sexuality. What I believe is that sexuality is so taboo because of the pleasure element of it. So I focus a lot on the pleasure element. And I think because we have all grown up in a Judeo-Christian society where the focus is on work, 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 you have to obey, you have to work, that's where we get rewarded. And if you have pleasure of any kind, you kind of are made to feel guilt, blame, and shame around that. And sexuality is really all about pleasure after all. And I don't think that pleasure is something that we feel comfortable with. And so it's translated into sexual pleasure. And I don't believe that, that element is ever raised or not raised sufficiently, certainly not in religious context, to be able to really get us to feel and embrace sexuality with all of the boundaries in place, with all of the safety measures in place. When I talk about that, I'm talking really about the intimacy of it. So I think it's about pleasure, the taboo around pleasure.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you. Father Bruce, over to you.
I hear what people are saying about the Judeo-Christian and heritage, but I think it goes much deeper, because across the world, no matter what faith background or even culture, there's a kind of shame attached to sexual pleasure or sexuality. And so I think this is almost something which goes beyond and deeper than our religious backgrounds. I think those are incredibly influential, but are insufficient to explain everything about this culture of shame that we experience around human sexuality. And so, I know from our own tradition, from the very beginnings, sex is seen as a necessary evil. And that if you go back to St. Augustine and St. Paul, it's better to marry than for a man to burn with lust. So I think it's also tied in with notions of patriarchy, which are hard baked into both culture and religion over thousands of years, not simply the Judeo-Christian tradition, although maybe we have kind of perfected our prejudice.
Thank you for the Bruce. Over to you, Anele.
I think I'll lean more towards around desire and pleasure. That church has an element of governance and control. That pleasure and desire is something that should be done privately. It's something that should be deemed as sacred. I can't fathom how radical sex as it is can be something that is sacred. When you have sex, that's the highest ultimate level of living your impulses. So I think the radicalness of how church thinks of sex, they cringe because of what we do when we do sex. However, the control around it has a lot to do with sex being used as a tool for procreation. So if you do it outside that, you are seen as a delinquent person. Hence, these ideas and notions that you have to be married before you can have sex, because it's about control and governance. And for me as a clinician, how do you govern such a precious and beautiful thing about pleasure, especially when people are enjoying sex? Now, also around this thing of pleasure and desire, we always think of sex within a compulsory heteronormative construct. Now, if you think of other non-heterosexual bodies, then sex is deemed as sinful because it's something that is also done by delinquent bodies. So until church thinks and constructs sex as a desire and pleasure that is out of autonomy and freedom of expression about my body, how do we rely so much on scriptures that say, keep your body as a temple of God? But this is my body. This is the very same God that gave me the desire and pleasure. So how do you control that?
It's Anela, I think you're all raising very important points. And I'm going to throw this at you, Rev D, because you touched on this briefly last week. Those who have not seen the teaching, you can check it out on our YouTube channel. But so Anela speaks about, how do I view sex as sacred? Considering everything that I would do while I'm engaging and going on a journey of pleasure with consent with the other, and you had a beautiful way of drawing parallels between communion and sexual intimacy. How can we do that? Because Anela's raising something very important. I'm raised to know that my body is a temple of God, and it's something that I should protect, but also I embody something greater than myself, whether you want to call it godliness, energy. But what I do know is that my body is a mystery to myself, and there's just something bigger and deeper about who I am. But how do I reconcile that to my sexual experiences and the pleasure that I would feel while engaging in sexual intimacy?
Well, what you realize with regard to sex is that sex is, for me, the only activity that when you engage all your five senses at the same time. Your sense of smell, of touch, of hearing, of sight, and I can't remember the fifth sense, but all of those senses are activated in that act, and you are aroused in all sorts of respect, and then to add to that, you use your body, your mind, and the sixth sense. It's also activated, which is a spiritual sense, because then in the bodies uniting, the spirits uniting, the minds uniting, you've got the sixth sense activated, and the two people that are engaged in this sacred thing, it is a soul to soul, it is a heartbeat to heartbeat. That is why sex is used to activate a soul bond because it is such a deep and mysterious thing, and therefore, if you've got these people not only connecting with their bodies and their minds, but also their souls interacting, there is already there a spiritual union that is happening there. And where there is that spiritual union, you will then understand that it becomes a holy communion, so to speak, between souls, and it becomes a deeply spiritual and a sacred thing. It is that act that makes a human being to experience or to express their godlike side in a very radical and practical way, because we were created not only to be procreators, but we were all created for recreation as well. So in that act, you've got all those things happening at the same time. It is a deep expression that covers the spiritual, the mental, the emotional, and the everything in between.
Thank you so much, Rev. I think you've just touched on so many aspects, and just listening to you, I just hear that you've got a very high regard of it, which is fantastic. But I'm just wondering, and Dr. Eve, I'm going to throw this one to you maybe as a start, is very often we, and I say we because we're a room full of most people that identify as Christians, most Christians have certain assumptions that we have, and we place those on the sexual experience based on some of the teachings that we've heard. You know, if you have heard some very positive teachings, which I think that's what you bring, Rev, is very different to some of the negative teachings that a lot of us have heard around sex. What are some of those assumptions that you've come across in your practice, and how do some of those theological or any of those internalized assumptions, what are those and how do they impact people's experience of it? Especially, I think you probably have quite a bit to share with us in line with your trauma background.
Yeah, I was just going to say, whatever the Reverend's studying, I want some of that because it sounds amazing. The description that he had, it was just very beautiful. And that's such an idealized way of being sexual, right? I mean, I just wish that for everybody. I really do. But as you say, Ilse, there are other factors that come in. So if you consider that within a Christian framework, within a religious framework, there are certain rules, which we all know, which is there should be no premarital sex. And I really want to just kind of linger a little on the word sex, because when we think about the word sex, usually everyone thinks about, penetration. So there is so much other sexual activity that people do and get very confused in a religious context about, am I having sex now? Am I still a virgin? Is this permissible? Isn't this permissible? It becomes very confusing. So there's, a problem with that actual word sex. So, having grown up in an environment where you want to be a Christian, or you are a Christian who's following all of the doctrines, and there is a rigidity, a strictness, a punishing of you should not be sexual, you can't have sex. So there are hormonal imperatives. There is a desire for intimacy. There is a desire to be present in one's body with pleasure, and yet that needs to be shut down. And then there's a huge trauma that happens on the wedding night, on the night that you are allowed to be sexual, where there is real difficulty in being sexual because there could be a huge amount of pain that many women do experience. There's a huge amount of ignorance that men feel that they don't really know what to do, or the anatomy, or how to manage themselves in a masculine kind of way. There's also a huge amount of guilt that will happen when there is sexual activity that they're doing premaritally. And then once they actually get married and they have the permission to be sexual, they find that they're just not able to do that. So that's a trauma that happens when there's a schism between what they think religion says about sexuality and what they then, think that their behavior has to reflect around it. And that's where the difficulty and the trauma happens, when there's then sexual dysfunction and difficulties that occur in a relationship. And of course, the intimacy is completely disrupted, which is, pretty tragic.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eve, which actually brings us to our next question. Now, Father Bruce, you're a Catholic priest, and I think we all know what the implication of that should be. I'll tell you, I went to a Catholic school, and initially I had wanted to be a Catholic priest. But there was just one thing that made me decide otherwise. Care to take a wild guess?
Let's just say he has a son.
What's that?
Let's just say Shoni has a son now. So.
I've got a son. Yeah, I've got a son. So the prospect of having Langal Malele one day, I was like, oh man, I don't know if I've been called to celibacy. And the truth is, when I was saying in actual fact, one of the things I was thinking about is that the deepest theological wrestle I had as a teenager was, God, why do I have these feelings? And how do I put them off? And yes, I'm going to wait till marriage. A lot of young people struggle with the idea of celibacy in between your biological development and getting married. And it becomes tough. And let's say I do go on the journey to say, this is the route I'm choosing for myself, because I find that the cultural expression of a safe space for sexual intimacy, according to Christian tradition, which I subscribe to, is marriage. And that's the decision I take, which is a decision I took. Is it a practical journey for young people? And how do we manage some of the difficulties, especially sometimes with like the ideas of touching yourself and all of that being demonized?
I'm going to take a rather roundabout route in answering. When I was doing my counseling training, one of the psychologists that I worked with had this wonderfully frank, open description of sex. Sex is something that you do on a Sunday afternoon when you're bored and it's raining with a friend. Sex is something that you do when you're angry and frustrated and you just need to burn the energy. Sex is something that you do when you want to show your love and commitment and connection. And the point being, sex is a multivalent symbol. Sex can mean many different things. And I don't think that's the conversation that Christians are actually able to have, because for us, we've painted human sex and human sexuality into a particular box. And if it doesn't fit that, then we're not actually living our God-given sexuality. And I'm wondering whether, have we really understood the gift of human sexuality adequately? And are we placing burdens upon people that God herself would not want them to bear? That's kind of just an interesting little kind of aside. When it comes to can one not have sex, or can one not masturbate, or etc., before marriage? I think there are many people whose form of sexuality is asexuality. People who have just experienced that for whatever reason, they're not called to be a sexual person. And that's a good, normal thing for them. And I think, so I don't think that there's any kind of standard, or all people are like this. All people you have people who have a low sex drive, and so once a month is already too much for them. And you've got those with a high sex drive and like, hey, 3 times a day and I'm that kind of guy. I think our human sexuality is far more complex than we're painting. And I think there's a lot more guilt around things like masturbation is a normal developmental thing that if a teenager didn't do it, you kind of wonder, well, what's wrong? But maybe that's just talking about me. So
it's really okay to laugh, guys. I think
so it's like, well, it's normal. And I think maybe to kind of give a slightly different focus, it's not about being sexually active or things like that, but really about when we do something, are we intentional about it? Do we know why we're doing it? And because our intentionality and our knowing is what gives our activity meaning.
Sure. Love it. Thanks. Okay, great. And then just to throw it then to Anela, so I remember chatting to a friend of mine, who also identifies as queer. And he says to me, we're actually speaking about porn. and he says, Shoni, one of the reasons I would watch porn is because the church has no teachings to offer around sexuality for someone who identifies as queer. And without going too much into your own personal experience, I just want to, in terms of your observation and some of the stuff that you would have heard, would you say that the church is actually at a position, to actually honestly speak about sexual intimacy for people who identify differently outside of our conservative boxes? I listen to Father Bruce right now, even the language I would have used to ask him the question that I asked, might, in my thinking, it might border more on like, okay, it's a man and a woman. Do you think that the church actually has offered and has equipped people for beautiful and sacred intimacy who may actually identify differently?
If you're going to talk about queer bodies and queer representations and throw sacred out, because church has no place of understanding romance, intimacy, and sex for queer bodies. Religion, spirituality in the way of how church thinks of it, is a thing that is basically ordained for heterosexuals. That's why heterosexuals can still do it and get away with it. People can be pregnant at church. The Reverend D, they will retain them back to church. However, for heterosexual bodies, it's a different ballgame. If there's only one place that has made me a delinquent, it's church. I'm a convenient, delinquent disciple of Jesus because church has always had prescriptions and compulsory ideologies that do not serve my interest. I want to follow Jesus and serve him fully. However, my sexual orientation and how I express my sex, it's deemed as a problem. This is why you don't see a number of queer people at church, because immediately it comes into my experience of how I want to experience love, romance. There's no language for it, but there's a language for a couple that is a male and a female. Our pastors, if you can ask Reverend Tuleng, is how many people often refer to as people as couples other than where's your wife or where's your husband, right? So in my view, church is still very far to understand politics and dynamics of romance, sex, desire that is out of compulsory heteronormativity. It will take us a very radical view. I always say, had it not been for my capitals, being who I am in the church, that I come with the capitals I possess as a media personality, as a local preacher, as someone that has studied theology, as someone who's educated, I don't think I'll still be in this church because I would have not have had the capital to understand that my faith and my calling can be exercised outside my way of being as a person. So a church itself, it denies us access into accessing God because the kind of God that church has is a God that only is a male and a female. So how do I identify as God with God who is only for heterosexuals? Who is made to feel inaccessible that when I sleep with my man, I am made to believe that I'm sinful, that I can't access God. There's an impurity that I can't access God because I have had sex with the man. So if church doesn't think in that way, it has taken me a very radical approach to have intimate sex, sometimes not penetration, but enjoyable physical sex with my partner in various ways and understanding my body. Rev spoke about psychosexual stages of development, and Dr. Eve highlighted to that. Thanks to Freud, who's radical about his views about sex and sexual repressions, that these things are primitive, even how we engage with our bodies. And so if there are certain fixations that the child or a young adult hasn't resolved, that's going to resort to psychological stagnation at some point. Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you so much. You've just given us so much to think about. And I want to kind of just circle back to something that has been kind of a common thread. Maybe it's just in my mind that it's a common thread, but this idea that we all come from very different perspectives. I think that's one thing we can agree on, is that our panelists have very, very different perspectives. I think one thing that we can agree on as a society is there kind of has to be some sense of guiding in terms of how we exercise our spirituality. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail because that in itself is assumptive, that we all come from a certain place. But maybe my question then is to say, what is some kind of culturally relevant way that we can teach? And I'd love everyone just to obviously speak from their point of departure and just to be honest from where you're at, whether it's a scientific point of departure, whether it's a theological, but what is some culturally relevant way we can teach? Is it still working, Carl? Thank you. We can teach about sex and have a safe space around it, so that everyone can continue and kind of live their life and express themselves without it being imposed that this is the only way to think about it. You know, we were speaking earlier, we were just doing a bit of a recording, and so we spoke to some great authors and podcasters, and we spoke about this idea of the purity culture. And so for some denominations, for a very long time, that was their safe space to say that, you know, sex outside of marriage is just a no-no. That's their safeguard. And so I'd love us all just to answer from our different perspectives. What is a way that we can teach and create a safe, culturally relevant safe space around sex? Maybe Dr. Eve, if you can kick us off, and then I'm going to ask everyone just to share things.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a sexuality educator and done a lot of work in the schools and written curriculums on sexuality education. I just want, before I go there, may I, Ilse, just kind of add on to what both the Reverend said and to what Anneli said. I want to agree with the Reverend. Sexuality has become a huge burden because of the pressure and expectation of the sacredness that religion has put around it. And we have to be really, you know, aware of that. And for you, Anneli, just to add to what you're saying, to expand it, it's not just monoheteronormative, but also we consider how many single people there are in the world, single men, women, and other genders, and how there isn't any kind of notion of what sexuality can look like for them. People who are able-bodied, disabled, people who are older, people who are younger, people who've been incested. You know, we really want to be really way more expansive about inclusion of them. So let me lead into sexuality. There is always this mistaken belief that sexuality education is there to teach children about the birds and the bees and the anatomy and physiology and masturbation and all of that stuff that really people learn about by themselves. It's teaching sexuality education begins from birth around safe touches, beautiful touches, respect for one's body, respect for the other, about communication, about attachment, about how to be respectful, talking about equity between different genders, being able to understand how to, in a patriarchal society, how to be able to treat women. It's about friendships, it's about conflict management, it's about critical thinking, it's about making decisions. And all of that will integrate in a very organic way into a situation where people find themselves having to make decisions around sexuality. If you imbue your own values, whatever they are, spiritual, religious, non-religious, but your own values of humanity or whatever you as parents or a parent want to imbue into your child, that's what they're going to draw on. That's what they're going to depend on when they're making sexual decisions for themselves.
Well, from my side, I want to start this by dealing with, I think, is the elephant in the room where church and theology and religion is concerned. The truth is the teaching that we get from the Bible around sex, well, I've already mentioned that it's predominantly a very negative depiction. But the second thing I want to allude to is that, for instance, if we base our views and our doctrines on the Bible, the biggest problem that we have is that, for starters, the Old Testament as we have it, where we're sitting now, we're looking at about 5,000, 6,000 years ago. And the society then, and the culture and the traditions that informed the people then, and how they developed their own worldview is very different from where we are in the 21st century now. And now we are transplanting the teachings of society or the people 5,000, 6,000 years ago and wanting to just give them to the 21st century human beings. Guys, as human beings, we are an evolutionary species. We evolve. Our thinking, our views, and our theology, our prayer life, our relationship with self, our relationship with God, we evolve. Nothing is ever stagnant. And therefore, you find that the teachings that we have, if there's any in the Bible anyway, are very archaic and therefore do not fit the paradigms we have in the 21st century. And before you shoot me for being a minister who does not take the Bible in its entirety, let me show you maybe one or two things that we have managed to do away with, and yet some other aspects of the Bible, we would just want to keep them as they are. In the Bible, slavery was perfectly good, acceptable. Try and get somebody to be your slave today. In the Bible, it was perfectly fine for you to beat up your wife and kill her, and you will not be arrested. In fact, there is an instance where a father gives over their daughter, Judges 19, religious people, Judges 19, where a father gives a daughter out for a group of hooligans to rape her. And after raping her, the father cuts her into 12 pieces and spreads the different ligaments of her body all over. He was not in trouble. He was never in jail for that. Try to do that today and see if you will survive. So my point is, in as far as sex is concerned, we have evolved. And we need to acknowledge that. We need to acknowledge, Annele spoke about Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud operated around 1923-24 when he came up with the theory of us being, having this animal instinct in us. And our primitive animal instinct in us include our sexual behavior and aggression. It's sex and aggression that Sigmund speaks about. And that part of us is evolving. So we need to, as the church, begin to draw up lessons and models that help us to evolve our own views about sexual energy. For us to help young people to understand, and all people in fact, to understand that sexual energy is not only to be dissipated in physical expressions, but you can in a very dynamic and creative way transmute that sexual energy into other areas of your life where you will become more creative, you will become more innovative. You use that to be excellent in your assignments and projects, to build wealth and to build a meaningful relationship by transmuting your sexual energy, which is a potent, highly creative energy that God has given us. What do? We spend it huffing and puffing in the physical only. No, use that energy for creative space. We will spin the economy of South Africa within a wink of an eye.
Amazing, amazing.
I think one of the most important things to do is stay the hard journey, even though it's challenging. And by what I mean by that is there are lots of good people within the faith tradition who will be kind of open to saying, well, we are meant to be led by science and our new understanding of what it means to be human. And that's not, I'm not inventing something revolutionary. This is actually part of our church tradition, that we are to be led by the evidence. And the evidence says that human beings, or our understanding of human beings, is different. It's grown, it's changed. So we need to be open to that. I think that's the first thing. I think we also need to liberate our sacred texts and convert them from documents of oppression to that of liberation, because there are ways of, well, new scholarship, new ways of reading and understanding the text which reveal hidden truths that the literalists and the fundamentalists are blind to. But there are different ways, I think more liberating ways of appropriating our scriptural texts. And I think the last thing I'd say is we find our own ways and reasons for staying. There are lots of queer people, LGBT people who've actually said, this is my church. I'm not going to be chased out of it by somebody else's prejudice. And it's only if people stay and do the hard work of conscientizing, of bringing about kind of new ways of thinking, that eventually change can and will happen. As the Rev said, yes, our ways of thinking about slavery and marriage and democracy and all of these things have changed radically over time because people have stayed, interrogated the evidence, reread scriptures in new ways. So those are the three things that I would bring from my tradition.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the Bruce.
I wonder and imagine what a safe space looks like for a Black child who is a conservative parent. There's on TV on the river, one of the stories kind of shows in South Africa, there was a scene about STIs as well as threesome that was introduced simultaneously at that time. And I think the message around there was to help parents to start these conversations. Our parents themselves, they find it very difficult to start that conversation as to when do I start it? Why do I start it? It's only, for me as a psychologist, it's either a parent is on a panic mode, that a child has either been exposed to porn.
Yeah.
There's a case where I'm dealing with a child who's merely 4 years old. The father has a sexual addiction. The child used the iPad of the father. And because it's linked to iStore, unfortunately, the child went to that site. The mother found the child watching this thing that has no meaning in it. Now, it might not have any meaning in it. Now, she's trying to engage and access as to what could be the possible implication of this. Now, it's not the child who has a problem, but it's the parent that has a problem, right? Which means that there are some cases where parents themselves have sexual addictions or sexual disorders, right? That they themselves, they may not have the capacity to start this conversation. So for me, an imagination of starting a conversation, it is as simple as being aligned with developmental stages of a child, where the child is at the time where you see that your child is mature. Trust me, young boys, 12, 13, very few of us can say they were not exposed to porn here. And it's that critical time to start creating that safe environment to say, there's something called porn and all of that. By the time a child engages with it, there's been an education around it. We would not be having teenage pregnancy if safe space were created It only ends at school and life orientation. When they come home, you don't talk about that. You can't even talk about the butterflies that I have about my person or this developing thing. Like, no, we can't talk about that. So how would then a child later, when they are 16, in fact, when they have a better understanding of what their bodies can do, and they can give themselves the privilege, when state and our constitution allows for these kids to have abortion at such a young age, why would you not then start creating these safe spaces at home? But our cultural notions of respectability, of culture, of governance, they limit parents from having this conversation up until it's either the boy has impregnated. I mean, Moja Love, we've got shows about teenagers that are expressing their journeys of being teenagers. If there can be such a show, it means there's space to do more.
Anela, thank you so much. That's very helpful, and
Thank you.
I'll make you laugh. You know, do you know how my sex education talk looked like? My dad came back from work. I think they gave them like this condom with 10 rules around sex, and then he looked away, and in Sesotho he said "Nka," like take, you know, and he just looked away and he walked away, and then out of excitement, it's like, I'm gonna go show my boys, you know, so we can laugh about it. And apparently, as I left the house, he was like to my mom, "Oh boy, he's gone. He's gonna go use it." You know, but I think it's a very valid point that you raised. And in a few seconds, we're gonna take questions. If you have any questions, you just need to put up your hand, and then we'll bring a mic to you. But in the meanwhile, I'm just gonna throw it out there. Rev D, Father Bruce, the first part of this question is for you, just in 30 seconds. The second part is for you, Dr. Eve and Anele. First part, do we under-spiritualize or underestimate the spiritual aspect of sex?
Mhm.
I.e., soul ties, is that a real thing? That thing freaked me out when I was a kid. You know, I don't know how many young people have actually gone to camps, undoing soul ties, calling people's names. Is it a real thing? Dr. Eve and Anele, do we over-spiritualize sex? Is it more biological? So maybe we'll start with Dr. Eve and Anele. Do you over-spiritualize sex? Do you make it too spiritual when it's really just two bodies meeting? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I'll start. I think for me, in my view, where I'm sitting, there is an element of spirituality if you think of wellness and the dimensions of wellness, physical, emotional, and all of that. But for me, I can't fathom, how can I be sacred when I'm having sex? Sex is the most wildest expression. So where's the spiritual element of it when I am in my ultimate utmost? Orgasm is the most exciting thing. How do I find spirituality in orgasm? But it's a way of expression. So if we think of desire again and romance and that, for me, I can't imagine how do we bring the Bible in the bedroom? How do we pray about having good sex? Am I going to ask you that? Which scripture would I use for us to lead us to a good sexual intimate moment when sex is that wild and so beautiful?
Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Eve.
Song of Solomon, right? Isn't it very beautiful? So yes, I do think that there's a hugely spiritual, and I don't mean religious, element to it. Unfortunately, it's happens when there's optimal conditions, meaning there's safety, there isn't risk, when two people feel safe and secure with each other, where they really feel they can be absolutely vulnerable and present in their bodies, completely able to do that. There is an element of almost transcending consciousness, reaching an altered state of consciousness when orgasm happens, or when that experience of really being seen, being heard, being attended to in that very unique way, which can only happen when two or more, doesn't only mean that there are two people who are present at that time, are engaging in activities which include their bodies and their genitals. Unfortunately, we live in a very traumatized society, collectively traumatized as well as individually traumatized. And so oftentimes the experience of being sexual can be very terrifying for people, and there's nothing spiritual about it. But in an optimal situation, I do believe that there is a transcendence into a incredible internal self part, as well as an internal connection with others who are experiencing the sexual activity together.
Thank you so much, Doc. Thank you so much.
I think we can both over-spiritualize and under-spiritualize. I mean, I don't think it's an either or. We do both. I do a marriage preparation as part of the teen ministry. And one of the talks we give is kind of on kind of sexual relations within marriage. And this is like the full team is there, and it's like so serious. And so I always like to kind of throw into my kind of talk, well, we also need to talk about fluffy pink handcuffs, because
Wow.
because sex is sacred and it's beautiful, but it's also meant to be fun and life-giving and joyful. So sex is meant to be playful and not simply done on your knees.
That's a lot to ask for conservatives, eh? I also need my answer around soul ties. I've got a feeling that I'm not the only one who wants that answer. We want to know,
It's
are we
not
meant to
part
be
of my
exercising
tradition.
people?
Not part of my tradition.
Okay, so there's no soul ties in your tradition.
Not like that, no.
Yeah, Mohuti, I'll break it down. Since you're gonna go on, like I've been told, like we were told that if you sleep with I want to find the name of a person I do not know so that they don't think I'm trying to if you sleep with Audrey, I don't know Audrey. If you sleep with Audrey and they tell you that if Audrey has slept with Canon, Jacobeth, and Scripture, then all of them are in your body, is that a real thing? And then obviously, do we over spiritualize or under spiritualize? But I'm desperately waiting to hear this answer.
I don't know.
This was like what? Wait, guys, am I being delusional? Wasn't this
maybe-
one of the biggest Christian teachings at some point?
I've seen it as an object lesson. You have your sticky tape in your cardboard box,
You
and
see-
you stick them to each other, and you try and separate them, and then
I think Dr. Eva is right. We are a very traumatized nation.
Yeah.
These are traumatic teachings.
You see, the problem with this whole thing is that religion has mastered the art of pushing and manipulating people with fear. And therefore, if you want to control anybody, make them fearful. Because then when the person is afraid, they dislodge from their mind, and you are able to control them. And, very many, maybe I'm exaggerating, a few of our doctrines, you look at them, it's doctrines that are meant to really make it easy to control the masses. And I think the whole thing with soul ties and how we treat sex, and we even invented the whole expression of sex before marriage is a sin. It's not there in the Bible. We just find very good sounding expressions that helps us to make people to back off. And the fact that men and women of the cloth have the preserve of the word and theology and teaching has been something that has been over many years being a problem. So I think the whole thing with soul ties comes from the whole fear thing being used to control the people, right? But sex, love making, is a beautiful gift of God. And by the way, in essence, now going over to Anela's point about how can we bring sacredness and Bible into the bedroom. Here's the point. We have been created by God to be in relationship. Relationship, fellowship, intimacy. It's who we are as a species. As a matter of fact, the biggest, greatest enemy of human species, if you ask me, it's loneliness.
Yeah.
We were meant to be in relationship with ourselves, in relationship with nature, in relationship with other people, in relationship with God. We were meant, and outside the relationship, we struggle to breathe, just like the fish struggles to breathe when it's out of the water. And therefore, when you look at Genesis chapter 3, speaking about Adam knowing Eve, Dr. Eve, Adam knowing Eve, the knowing aspect, or the term that is used there, reflects or refers to a very deep relationship of a connection with another, where I am connected to you emotionally, spiritually, physically. I just want to know you, right? And that's why, and it's a beautiful thing, guys, to know a person deeply in a way that you can almost finish their sentence. You know, Dr. Eve referred to the book of Solomon. Solomon was a great guy, and we should all learn from him. The guy had 800 concubines. He should know better about these things. You know, and he's very poetic in that thing, articulating the whole thing of love, sex, love making in very beautiful, beautiful terms. And that is the most positive expressions that you get in the Bible. And those expressions, unfortunately, are very silent in the Bible. You need to be you have a trained mind to be able to know that the word used in Genesis 3 refers to something deeper than just sex. And therefore, we are a species of relationship, intimacy, and we are love. Guys, we are love. And that is why sex is appealing to us, because sex is actually an expression of the deepest love that you have for another human being. And that is why sex, in very well-polished terms, is called love making. And to link up with Father Bruce's thing, that is why the other sex is not supposed to be a very serious thing that is like very muted. It's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be funky. It's supposed to be activating, accelerating. And that is why before you go to the main course in sex, you start with what we call, wait for it, foreplay. Before the play. And the before the play is because sex, you're supposed to be playing, you're supposed to be having fun, supposed to be accelerating. My goodness, let me stop.
Sorry, Cloney, I want to check something. I'm just thinking of what Cloney said earlier about queer bodies. As to how then do we make that Fundisi beautiful for queer people? Because there's a double bind here. You queer, you gay, lesbian, trans, intersex, and you have sex. How do we make that experience non-guilty, to say? Like, how do I engage with this sex without being worried about being gay, being not worried about sex? How do I find the joy and that expression of God without being problematized? Even to you, Brother Bruce.
I don't know how you're going to do that when you have allowed yourself to carry the feelings of guilt that have been imposed on you as a queer person. I don't know how you're going to enjoy that, except the fact that you need to be able to be liberated and radical enough to know that there is more to life and love and sex than just a man and a woman. Did you realize in my description that I actually did not even refer to or restrict sex or knowing a person to man and a woman? Knowing a person, you know a person when you know a person. And it doesn't matter what gender they are or what orientation they are. All of that is the gift of God that God has given to us as human beings. So guilty feelings, I don't know how to help you with that, my bro. You need an exorcism of guilt.
But that is a very idealistic way for this,
Yeah.
because we're talking about church here that is very dogmatic, very rigid in its ways of thinking. It's probably the first church that I hear we even talk about queer bodies and a consideration of alternative sexualities and expressions. But take me to Soweto and everything in any place, that infinity, it also requires a psychological capital of emotional intelligence to be able to get to that point. But I think what Lon was talking to, a person that does not hold these capitals. Yeah, maybe Tony or brother.
Let me go back to what I'd said in a kind of earlier conversation about people need to discover their own reasons for staying. To say that I refuse to be, or to accept your definition of me. Now that's obviously a lot harder to do than just me saying it. And so I think what we try to do is to say, well, if God has created you in a particular way, then you need to do your best to be that best you, whether it's gay, queer, straight, whatever. I mean, that's my kind of fundamental position. God has a vision for you, and the church exists to help you realize or maximize that vision. At Holy Trinity, where I'm pastor, there's been a support group for kind of the LGBT community for many years, not to make them straight, but to say, how can we help you with the challenges that you're experiencing? And it's never a, oh, well, if you're here, you have to be celibate, you have to avoid sex, you have to. We take people where they're at, and I think journey with them, and that journeying with is a wonderful metaphor and image that Pope Francis kind of introduced again into our discourse. It's about taking people where they're at, not where we want them to be. And I don't even think that my vision of where I think people should be is, oh, well, we're journeying on this kind of road from queerness to straightness. That's not the journey. The journey is inward, and the journey is about being who you were meant to be, but to the best way possible. But now it requires those with capital to be the change makers, or to create the kind of environment where people do feel safe. And so one of my predecessors in the parish, he had actually started the support group because it was a need of the people. That people had come to him and said, well, Father, this is our struggle, and we just want a safe space that we can actually gather and talk to one another. And we were able to create that space for them. And it's still there for kind of generations of queer people who have found in the church the beginnings of a safe space.
Thank you for the Ruth. And then not to cut you short or to undermine your question at all, I think it's a really important conversation. And I think you touch on the fact that there are very few churches and very few spaces like this where we can have conversations like this. And because of that, I want to just allow us just a little bit of time, because we are almost out of time, just to allow everyone in the room Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to take questions from the online at the moment, but anyone in the room that has any questions, like we said, this is a safe space to ask questions. So please ask any questions that you want. You can direct them in general to the panel. You can direct it to an individual if you want to. And please don't feel like it has to be a certain type of question, but allow it to be any kind of question. I think we've got great minds in this room, and this is probably going to be one of those really lucky opportunities to ask questions. So we've got our first mic. Thank you so much.
Good evening. For this question, I just wanna, in general, to the whole panel, except one member, him. That's because he's my father and it's about him.
Don't be personal, son.
So the first thing is I want to focus on what Anele had said with Black communities and being able to speak freely in a safe space about sex. I mean, other than last week in the car ride back home, the only other time I was able to speak with my parents about sex was 2018, and it was so awkward. I don't even remember half of the conversation. It happened at Christmas dinner. That's how awkward it was. And basically, it's come to a point where in the minds of Black young people, it's so uncomfortable to just speak about sex freely with another older Black person, you know. There was a situation where we were in a class and I think it was life orientation. And the first lesson, it was a white teacher who came to speak to us about sex, and the conversation was booming. You know, everybody was taking part. And the second time, it was still the same white teacher, but now her HOD, a Black lady, was in the room. And I don't know whether it was because we're all just deciding to behave because the boss is there, but generally nobody spoke, you know, and the majority of the questions weren't the same in the same light as they were in the beginning. It was almost just like, let's just do it so we can make the teacher look good, you know. So how do we as, and I'm going to focus on a Black community because that's where I feel it's at. How do we as a Black community bridge that gap where we're able to have a safe space with your parents, you know, elderly people, specifically around sex, porn, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, Father Bruce, you want to take that one?
Challenges are around kind of generational respects. I mean, I know that when I was in Soweto, I spent 10 years in Orlando West. People wouldn't smoke in front of me. They wouldn't drink in front of me, just because it's like, oh, you know, this person is sacred and we can't disrespect them. And I think the same dynamic is at play with elders in a community. But in this case, it's not simply that, well, where does reluctance come from? That there's actually a lot of pushback from, certainly when I had these kinds of conversations with young people, that it was kind of elders themselves that were uncomfortable because they'd never had the experience themselves. So maybe the solution is for leaders in the parish to actually have these kinds of conversations, forget the awkwardness, or at least work through it. I mean, most clergy are not going to be shy about talking about real things. So I spent a few years where kind of sex was my business, not in that way, but I was an HIV counselor, and I was doing pre and post test counseling for pregnant women. And so, and I don't think I'm terribly unique. I think most of us in the clergy have some kind of experience like that. And we're not ashamed or embarrassed or afraid to talk about real things. Mm. And maybe we need to get the clergy to be leaders in this. And there are obviously going to be different challenges because, oh, how can you, a holy man of God, talk to my teenage son or daughter about X, Y, Z? And that's why it does take a community conscientization process.
Thank you, Father Bruce. Dr. Eve, I don't know if you want to add from your perspective to this question. I don't know if you did hear the question. Oh, sorry, just a second. I don't know if you muted from your side, Dr. Eve.
Yeah, there we go. Sorry, I had to get my battery. What I'm most curious about is what this young man wants to learn about, because I don't want a top-down approach where we as the experts kind of tell the youth what they want to know about. So I would like to throw it back to the young man and say, what is it that you're curious about? What is it that you want to learn about? Because you're getting a lot of information online, probably all incorrect or probably from a very different perspective. So, what is it you want to learn about? What is it that you think, elders or the church or, therapists can teach you? What is it you want to know?
Not so much on a specific topic as to say, I want to learn about X, Y, and Z. Just
Right.
in general, I'm talking about how do we help in creating a space where we can have a conversation. And even if I do on one day wake up and think, no, I want to speak about pornography,
Yeah.
I know that this space is available to do so.
Yeah. Topics need to be discussed within a context, right? And I think that the things that I know just from my practice and my work is the things that people really long to know is how to connect and how to be respectful. And certainly for young men, I know the issues that they're dealing with, the young men that I come into contact with, is really around consent, for example. That would be a big thing that I think is important for people to know about, for young people to know about. They're really confused around dating, how to approach. There was a study that came out recently that showed that sexuality or sexual activity between the ages of 18 and 24 in the US had dropped substantially. And when they looked, what was it that caused such a drop in sexual activity in that age group, which we think should be or used to be the most sexually active, one of the reasons that they said was that there was social media. So people were spending a lot of time on social media, engaging, courting, and even being sexual on social media. And the other things that because of pornography that people were engaging with. And the third thing was that men were saying, specifically young men, well, we're really terrified to go out and to be with people, male or female or trans, whatever, however you identify, because of the fear of being accused of rape or sexual violence or sexual assault. So, we want to be really mindful of how do we build in confidence and how do we actually learn how to connect in a healthy and safe way with other people.
Maybe we'll just take the next question.
Good evening, everyone. My question is around sexual assault specifically. With regard to sex, how does, for instance, a young boy or girl, how do their view of sex change if they are sexually assaulted in any way? How does their view and their expectations of sex later on change to a person who's not specifically sexually assaulted, for instance?
Thanks for the question. I think we're going to kick this one to you, Dr. Eve, and then Anele as well, if you're comfortable.
Yeah, so people who have been sexually assaulted, violated, incested or raped, they have a higher risk of sexual dysfunction or sexual difficulties in their own lives, specifically a loss of sexual desire, loss of confidence, and people go into a state of, of trauma, of shutdown, and not being able to feel safe and trusting in a sexual way again, and so may become avoidant of intimacy. And I, applaud and really resonate so much with what the Reverend was talking about, in that we as humans, he was talking about it from a religious, spiritual point of view, but certainly from a neuroscientific point of view, which is, where I come from, we're meant to be connecting. So it's an incredible violation. It's an incredible loss when there has been a sexual assault and violation, because the intimacy is disrupted. The ability to be intimate and to connect with another human being is disrupted. And that's where the tragedy is, and that's where the healing has to come from.
At the moment, I'm writing a memoir on something like what you just asked, drawing from my own personal experience, but also from my clinical work. There's always a theme around over-sexualization, that you get introduced to something that, especially if it happened in childhood, that this child does not have a negotiation of a healthy kind of sex and everything that goes with it. But just touching on that, Hloni, on my chapter that I'm writing at the moment about the disdain of sex and sexuality, that out of my own personal experience of being repeatedly sexually molested by someone that I knew repeatedly, and it felt normal. I didn't even notice that it was wrong, because I thought it was something that was there. And in the township, there's this name that's used if you are gay called Butsisi. So I probably related with Butsisi at such a young age, and I thought maybe that's what's being done to Butsisi. Now, where I'm sitting as a psychologist and a clinician that has done so much psychoanalytic work and being in therapy, my struggle has always been, what is sex and what is control and power? So for the longest of time, and again, within politics of being queer, top or bottom and all of that, I never wanted to be anything that reminds me of that experience. So being a queer person, sex has been a struggle, because I really asked myself, am I gay because of a sexual act that happened? And it introduced me into understanding sex between males, or is it that something that I struggle with generally? So that struggle was still work until I had to work with a psychoanalyst to help me understand your beingness, your sexual orientation, and the negotiation. So there was a lot of conflict psychologically around what happened to me, what my body knows, what my memory knows, what my trauma knows. So when I have sex, is it my memory? Is it my trauma? Or is it my experience that's pure? And I think generally that's what people always struggle with, especially even with males who have been sexually molested by other males. There are those who probably, majority may be straight, but for some, people even struggle. Are you really gay because you're gay, or you're gay because of the sexual penetration?
Thank you for sharing. We've got a question on this side.
My question is, when we were talking about sexual pleasure, so like I know people don't only have sex to make a baby, because they're also times they want to pleasure their partners and make them happy or so. But then when we talked about, and then I think you mentioned like how when we said don't have sex before marriage, but then that's not in the Bible. So I get confused. So what do they mean by, if sexual pleasure is not really a sin, but then I think it was also clearly stated that pleasure is a sin according to God. Yes. So if it's not a sin, then how would we classify, how would you explain that sexual pleasure is not a sin if there's also a statement in the Bible where God says you should not be committed to pleasure?
Rebdi, you want to take this one to maybe clarify where you're coming from?
Okay. The issue about sex and sin and before marriage and all that, there is no direct expression like that in the Bible, that sex before marriage is a sin. What people are implying and interpret in the broad framework of what the Bible is saying about sex is the whole issue of abusing sex, and the assumption that you can only practice safe sex, and it is safe to do so when it happens within the context of a marriage, right? And therefore, the assumption is that within the context of a marriage, it's safe and it is protected and it is with only that person, right? And where we have a problem now is the reality that we all know of a lot of sex that happens outside marriage, before marriage, in between marriage and after marriage, and every time. And we can't behave, we don't know that is happening, right? And therefore, we've got to then ask very deep question around our belief about sex and about marriage itself. Well, then that will open another big topic around marriage and how we understand it in the biblical sense and how we accept formulated doctrines around it. Because there are different models of marriage and relationship in the Bible itself, which is highly controversial. So it is a very murky space. It's a murky space. And this is where I agree with Dr. Siswan. No. Yes. To say that how do you legislate for sex as a church? How do you legislate for sex as a country even? Except where it is used as a tool of violence and crime, how do you legislate for that? And if you legislate for it as the church, how do you police it? Those are the questions.
Thank you. We're going to just take two last questions just in the interest of time. So, TK, do you mind just handing the mic over that side? And then that will be our last question. And then just for those that maybe have questions before he gives us these questions, there is going to be a link that we are going to send out where you can ask more questions, and they're anonymously submitted. So don't feel like you're going to be exposed, but we are going to have some time later on in our series where we'll look at some of the questions that have been asked, and then you'll get some more answers. Thank you.
My question is to Father Bruce and the Reverend on what Anele said. How long will it take the church to evolve to accept gays of LGBTQ people? Because you said, Reverend, the Bible was written over 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, and today slavery is abolished. The Cape colonists were here in 1652. That's not even 400 years ago. So will it take us 5,000 to 6,000 years for the church to start accepting or evolving to accepting gay people? Because gay people are allowed to get married, not in front of all the churches, but since 2006 in South Africa, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So how long will it take for the churches to evolve or accept in a broader sense of view?
The church isn't monolithic in that you have some denominations already completely accepting and others obviously not. So that's kind of the first point. There's already kind of change and acceptance. It depends on where you look for it. I think when it comes to the more traditional mainline churches, Methodists and Catholics and Anglicans and all of those kind, change is happening, but it's happening slowly. I think it is also quite difficult for the church to have a serious conversation about, let's call it good queer sex, when the church doesn't think that any sex should be happening at all. So I think that's like the first conversation to have. And it's about if we in the church or in conservative mainline churches, if we are saying that our a priori kind of standpoint is all sex is heterosexual, we then have nothing to say about queer sex or queer relationships. So I think we need to first get to that point where we say, well, actually, it's normal. And once we can say, yes, it's normal, then the church can start to say, well, and how does a good queer relationship look? And how might that be different to a heterosexual relationship? Because I don't think they have to be exactly the same.
Are we comfortable with that? Okay. Okay, let's go to the next question. Thanks. Last question.
Okay. My question is going on sort of that question and then what was mentioned earlier. So as much as I agree that queer people should be able to occupy spaces the same way that like their heterosexual counterparts should. However, I feel like oftentimes we do place the burden on queer people to make those changes and to change those spaces. But how as a church can we make those changes instead of putting that burden on queer people when there is so much trauma experienced?
In fact, Reverend D, I took a sabbatical leave from church. Up until when, I don't know. Because I can't be in a church non-affirmative space for my own politics as a queer person and all of that. And in relation to that, I'm tired of being an activist. I'm tired of being the noisemaker. I'm tired of being I'm even known as that gay boy, right? In conferences, you know, all we know, without even knowing what's going to be my next point, we know he's pro this. So my position to take a sabbatical leave from church, like, you know what? I know Jesus has my back, but the people have no backing. So, but the compassionate burnout and spiritual burnout of being an activist, maybe it's another conversation.
I think the reason why I still believe queer people need to take leadership in this, and those of us that are progressive and open-minded and supportive should be following and supporting. It's because you look at the histories of any struggle. Struggles must be led by those that are on the receiving end of the oppression. The Black people did that in the Methodist Church, and I'll talk to about the Methodist Church because that's the church I know. Black people did that in 76 when it was necessary to do that. Women are picking up the struggle and they need to do that, and we support them and they receive alliances from men. Queer people must do that. You go into the Bible that we're talking about here. Liberation is never led by the oppressors, and I'll tell you why. It's because it's a question of power. Power is never voluntarily given. Never. Not with human beings. You must take it. You must demand it. You must thwart it. And it's not going to be given to you on a silver platter. Queer people must launch the struggle and never get tired. Take a sabbatical leave if you need to. Rest a little bit. Come back, but because you are the one who feels the fire, and you must express that fire. Otherwise, we're going to move on and forget about you. Aluta, continue.
The struggle continues.
Thank you for all the questions. Just a reminder, so we're going to send out a link. If you have any more questions, maybe you are watching this online and you have some questions and you're not able to be in the room to ask the questions, you'll be able to ask those questions. I just want to give Dr. Eve a quick chance because she's not in the room and it might be a little bit more difficult for her just to jump into the conversation. So Dr. Eve, is there anything else that you wanted to share with us? Maybe some last words or anything like that?
Just to say thank you for including me. And I think it's very important that we actually listen to what the young people are saying and to be able to give them what they are seeking, not what we think. I'm just repeating myself, not what we think that they need to have. There's absolutely a need for basic 101 facts, which is not going to be found on porn, for sure not, but they require more that we listen to them and what it is, because their world, their culture, their lives are very different to what our generation, or certainly any generation other than theirs, is. So I'm hoping that this will open up a space for them, a safe space for them to be able to feel free to ask for and let us know what their needs really are. And thank you for inviting me and including me on your panel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eve, and thank you to everyone that is joining us here. And just in parting words, the first thing I really want to affirm what Rev Mukhumuzi said, and I think all of us have shared in different ways, you know, that in as much as it might be a traditional teaching around saying finding safe spaces for sexual intimacy, but it remains something we treasure, because if we're going to say sex is beautiful, you want to I don't want to say you want to protect something that's beautiful, but you want to hold it with that beauty that is warranted. I want to say thank you, Anele. Thank you, Dr. Eve. You come from a world that has normalized our bodies. You come from a world that has normalized the feelings that we have. We don't have to demonize ourselves today. And it's because of brave voices like yourself. Dr. Eve, I always listen to your contribution on a particular radio station. You've helped me normalize my body so much, and thank you. But also thank you, Father Bruce and Reverend Mokhomotsi. You come from a world that also forces us to think very deeply about sexual intimacy. In actual fact, I can say to this day that one of the reasons I respect consent, even from my wife, is because of a church that encouraged and challenged me to hold my sexuality in a way that is sacred. And so thank you so much. We appreciate your contribution to tonight. And that's it from us. Join us for the next conversation. Next week, we're in conversation with book authors of the Grade 6 Rescue, who also lead a very beautiful podcast. And then on the last week, we will be we'll be focusing on a Q&A and just engaging some questions that you might really have. And so my encouragement to you is, even if you're online, feel free to check out the link, which we'll post in the comment section. Drop us your questions. And man, Christians, let's normalize speaking about sex, because we think about it more than we actually acknowledge it. Thank you so much.
Awesome. And thank you to everyone in the room tonight, guys. It's really awesome to have you. And we're going to just close off with a word of prayer for tonight as we go out. Lord God, thank you for spaces like this where we can just be ourselves and just ask those questions that we all have and just be able to be together as people who don't have it all figured out, don't agree, don't always have the right words. God, just help us to ease our minds tonight, and that any questions that we have may find a way of coming to the surface so that we may express them, and that they're not just fester, God, but that they are able to come to light, because light is where the truth is, God. And so allow it that come to light and let it get to a space where it can be encouraged and addressed. And so, Lord, we just pray for your blessing tonight for each and every person here, that you may bring them home safely. And thank you for bringing them here. In your mighty name we pray. Amen. Thank you so much.
Join us for Closer next week. Closer, please.